chapter 1, verse 17. Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. Therefore, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 generations.
Good to see everyone. I want to start this morning by saying again how happy we are to be a part of a congregation that obviously loves the Bible. There's so many people here who obviously read their Bible every day, and I know a lot of you are trying to become more and more like that, where you are into your Bibles. I think after becoming a Christian, making that decision, it's probably one of the key moments in anybody's life. It's such a significant decision to become a daily Bible reader, to make that choice. I know it made all the difference for me. I, like a lot of you, have been around the church all my life, or most of my life, and but that was when things really started to come together for me, is when I tried to make it part of something outside of this building. It's not easy getting started. I bet a lot of you have stories to tell of, like, obstacles that you had to get around to find out what time of day you would read your Bible and things like that. And there's some challenges that are not that easy to get around. And I bet a lot of you could sympathize with this story, is where you get motivated, and another guy like me gets up and says, we need to read our Bibles every day, and you think, I'm going to make that choice again, or maybe I'm going to make that choice for the first time. And so you think, okay, I'm just going to start in Genesis, and I would recommend that for everyone eventually. But it's kind of this is how it usually goes for a lot of us, is we read about creation, and then you read about the fall, and you think, okay, I know about this, and then Cain and Abel. Then you get to Genesis 4:18, and you read, now to Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael became the father of Methuselah, and Methuselah became the father of Lamech, and it goes on, and you're confronted with this long list of names, and that's kind of overwhelming. And so you think, well, maybe I'll start in Matthew. And you go to Matthew 1:3. Judah was the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. And it feels like reading a phone book. I bet some of you have felt this before, and you've probably even thought, well, how does this help with my life to look at this list of names? Ram was the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. Now go out there and be a Christian. And first, it might be important to remember, the Bible's not a reference book. Reading a little bit every day is good, but it's meant to be taken as a whole. It's a mistake to kind of just go to your Bible and open it randomly and say, okay, let's look for one verse I can carry around today. I guess it's better than nothing, but it's designed to require effort. It's not a reference book to glance at once in a while. It's meant to be woven into your life. It's meant to be part of you. You can gain insight from one verse, but some insight comes from studying larger parts. And it's also important to remember that everything in the Bible is there for a reason. There's nothing haphazard about it. And even here, in Matthew 1, it seems like just a list of names, but there's so much more going on. And I'm not going to try to convince myself that I'm going to be thorough at all, but I thought I'd point some things out this morning about this particular passage. It's obviously a genealogy. I don't know if you remember, some of you weren't even around. 1977, I had to look it up. Do you remember when Roots came out, the miniseries? And everybody loved the idea. Alex Haley, if you don't know, he was this man who researched his roots about 4 or 5 generations back. And this was in 1977. And this trend started. Everybody wanted to know who their great-great-grandfather was, and so on. Everyone was interested, and it kind of became this badge of honor to say, well, how far back do you know your lineage? How many greats, can you trace back? There was even, and I think you of course could do this still today, where you hire people to research your genealogy. And I bet some of you already know. Some of you can go pretty far back. We were actually with some friends last evening, and she was telling us how she's been researching her family. She can go back to the 1500s. I bet you can do better than that, maybe. You probably noticed that other people's genealogies aren't as interesting to you as your own. If people can rattle off a bunch of names and say, oh, that's great for you, but It doesn't have much to do for me. And we're proud of our lineage. I was thinking about this too. If we can name several generations back, we're kind of proud for certain reasons. First of all, if we can go back pretty far, like I can say, yep, back to the Mayflower, or maybe a particular tribe of people, or if somebody's famous, you can link yourself maybe to Abraham Lincoln. Or interestingly enough, if there's something scandalous, say, oh yeah, my great-grandfather was, he was messed up. So there's, other than the simple number of generations, we like famous and infamous details about our family history. Famous probably makes it feel more significant. Infamous makes it maybe more interesting. And it's also just kind of fun to maybe trace things back and say, wow, and find that weird family member. Unless you figure out it's me, then you're kind of startling when you discover that you're the one that's the weird one. These are the things that make lineages interesting, I think, is the number of years, how far back you can go, and the connections to famous people, and the darker parts. They seem to kind of jump out at us. It's just kind of interesting going upstream. The first part of Matthew is the genealogy, of course, of Jesus. And as I mentioned, part of the difficulty here is other people's genealogy is not as interesting as your own. But this does have some things that might be of interest to you. It goes pretty far back. There's some famous people involved, and there's even some darker parts. You'll notice pretty quickly that it's divided into three sections. Abraham to David is section 1. David to the captivity in Babylon, or the deportation, that's section 2. And then from the captivity to Jesus is section 3. And God used Matthew to record this, and he intentionally arranged it a certain way. And as with everything God does, there's a reason that he does it. There's several reasons for this genealogy, and I'm going to only point out a few things that might be of interest to you and of use to you this morning. Here's Matthew 1, starting with verse 1. If you be patient with me, we'll read through this. Any advice to anybody who has to read these out loud, just say it with confidence. Nobody knows for sure how they were pronounced. So if you just say it confidently, usually you can get away with it. Unless you tell everybody like I just did, then you probably won't. Matthew 1, verse 1, the record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David the king. And the first thing it's helpful to know when you're looking at this, we're going to go on here in just a second. The Gospels were written, of course, for all of mankind. But when they were first written, each of the Gospels had a specific audience in mind. God used Matthew to write to the Jews. Now, any Gentile reading this, any non-Jew reading this list would be like most people. You just see a list of names, doesn't mean much to you. But this list would be very important to a Jew. A Jew would see this differently, and so it kind of helps to kind of see it through their eyes. In fact, we probably have a better grip, where a lot of these names are more familiar than to most people. But it's important to establish in their minds what was going on here is that you can trace Jesus back to Abraham's. And this first part is Abraham to David. Notice that there's 3 milestones on the way to Jesus. And Abraham's this first one. Abraham was a man who God made a promise to. Years before, this is what God said to Abraham in Genesis 12:3. So in Genesis 12:3, part of the promise that God directly gave to Abraham was this: in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. In other words, someday, somehow, because you existed, this childless old man, someday you will have affected the world. And of course, he's talking about Jesus. The whole world is going to be blessed because of you. So no wonder God would choose Abraham as a kind of mile marker in this lineage. This first part takes us from the patriarchs to the best of the kings. And as you're reading along, maybe I'm reading your mind, maybe not. I get to the name Perez and Zerah, and I think, I know the others, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, got that. Then you get to Perez and Zerah. I wanted to point out, this is one part where the genealogy kind of gets dark. If you're familiar with this is Genesis 38, where Judah, the man, makes a pretty big mistake. And as God often does, he turned the mistake into a blessing. Twins are a direct result of this mistake, and the twins' names were Perez and Zerah. I think it's interesting that once in a while, God will use names and their meanings to play significant parts in what's going on. Perez, the name means a breakthrough of some kind, a good thing, a breakthrough. Zerah means a dawning or brightness, so it's kind of like light breaking through is what their names mean. I think it's significant that during this time of darkness, on the way to Jesus, we have two names that combined represent this breakthrough of light. You have to be kind of careful. You don't want to overanalyze all the names, but they do seem to mean something in some cases. Sometimes they matter very much. And there's other names on this list, and their names have meanings, but for the sake of time, we may look at those later. Another name that might jump out at you is Salmon, and he was a spy, which is kind of interesting. It'd be fun if you went back in your genealogy and were able to find a spy in your family. But he was a spy. He was sent to Jericho. He's one of the ones that Rahab hid, and interestingly enough, they got married. He rescued Rahab, got her out of Jericho, and they had a son named Boaz, who ended up marrying a woman named Ruth, who became the grandparents of David. This means King David was descended from Rahab, who had a terrible background, and from Ruth, a nobody outsider. One thing I learned from this list that I think we can take home from this is God is very good at making good out of bad. So the next mile marker, like Abraham, God also made a promise to David. 2 Samuel 7:16, God said this to David. So it kind of makes me think of God's conversation with Abraham. Here's God's conversation with David. 2 Samuel 7:16. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. In fact, there's several times in the Bible where God describes the lineage as this lamp being passed along from generation to generation. I couldn't help but think of the Olympics coming up where the torch is kind of passed. That torch would never go out. That's what his promise is to David. So now we read this list of names. Look at Matthew 1:6. See what you notice. I know it's just a list of names, but I bet some will jump out at you. And you notice this is kind of this idea of this lamp or torch being passed from generation to generation. Here's Matthew 1:6. David was the father of Solomon by Bathsheba, another mistake, but used to result in good, who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asa. Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah. Uzziah was the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amon, and Amon the father of Josiah. Josiah became the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. So I'm going to just touch on a few. Obviously, this is a list of kings. Some were good, some were bad. Rehoboam was the guy that rejected the good advice. He's the one that split the kingdom into two pieces. Jehoshaphat was kind of known for making bad alliances. He kind of hung out with Ahab, which you probably remember was a bad king. Uzziah, we mentioned him in the Isaiah class. He's the one that walked into the temple not having clearance to do that and was afflicted with leprosy because of it. And then Hezekiah was the king that put the letter in front of God asking for help and then asked for more time. And then Josiah was the one who restored the temple and cleaned the kingdom of idolatry. Kind of pretty important to demonstrate that Jesus was descended from kings. The first readers of Matthew would want to see that. Say, oh yeah, Abraham and King David. That would jump out at them because he's the king of kings. It just makes sense. The third mile marker, when Babylon destroyed the kingdom, the people were taken away into captivity. And here's some of the names mentioned here. Here's Matthew 1:12. Here's the last part. See if any names seem familiar to you. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. This is when the names become less familiar to me. Zerubbabel was the father of Abihud, Abihud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor. Azor was the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Akim, and Akim the father of Eliad. Eliad was the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob. Oh, that sounds familiar. Jacob was the father of Joseph, getting more familiar. the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who was called the Messiah. A couple things that might be of interest to you. Jeconiah was the next to the last king of Judah. That first guy that's mentioned. Zedekiah was the last king. Zerubbabel, he was one of the guys that led the group back to Jerusalem to recover everything. That took several generations, people doing that. And the escape from captivity appropriately leads to Jesus. And I appreciate your patience in this. This is kind of one of the hardest parts of the Bible to kind of look at, in my opinion. But you see God's hand arranging the arrival of Jesus and using good and bad. He designed the perfect plan for our rescue. But let's look at the obvious structure, and this is what kind of caught my attention about this. God obviously points to the structure of this. In fact, in order to set up this structure, he actually left out some names. Some of you may know this. They are not literally, some of these, the sons of these people. Sometimes the Bible will refer to somebody as their father when in actuality it was their grandfather or great-grandfather. We do it all the time when we say our forefathers. Same idea, saying we're descended from that. And he did it to kind of round it out on purpose. He makes it a point to, first of all, set up 3 sections. And as Brent read for us, you notice the number 14 shows up 3 times. So 3 sections of 14. Here's Matthew 1, verse 17 again. So God does this on purpose. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So he intentionally arranges this genealogy. Abraham to David, 14. David to captivity, 14. Captivity to Jesus, 14. And he did this for a very simple reason. Nothing too fantastical. It was easier to memorize. That's really the main reason. And if you can imagine, I know some of us have memorized verses before. I've never met anybody who's memorized this. But that was one of the reasons why this is structured this way. We kind of take it for granted that we can just open the Bible. But even then, why would somebody memorize this? Well, it's a record of God's promise. The children of Abraham, the kings that led to the King of Kings, the captive descendants, leading to the hero who would one day set all of humanity free. It was so important to the original readers that they would memorize the names, much like you've memorized the names of your genealogy. I bet some of you can name quite a few names. You could probably fill out your family tree. In fact, I know one family has most of their family tree right here in this room. But something to keep in mind, God is the ultimate author, and whereas other authors use ink and paper, he uses people and the world, and he often will use existence to make a point. Hopefully, all this shows how Jesus' genealogy is relevant to us. But there's something else that makes it, in my mind, even more relevant. You may be well aware of this. At various points in the Bible, it talks about you. It talks about you and me. I'm going to give you 3 examples really quick. It talks about all the people that weren't born yet. Here's Psalm 22. Here's 3 that I could find. These kind of jumped out at me, especially the day that I read it and thought, wow, this is talking about me. Psalm 22:31. They will come and will declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has performed it. Go to Psalm 78, verse 6. Psalm 78, verse 6. That the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children. One more in Psalm 102, Psalm 102, verse 18. I like how it's put here in particular. Psalm 102, verse 18. This will be written for the generations to come, that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord. It's really, really important to know God has always had you in mind. He always had. I really believe that. He doesn't just have people accidentally show up and try to fit him in somewhere. He has always had you in mind as much as anyone mentioned in the Bible. In fact, you and I are living during the culmination of all this. Hebrews 12:22 talks about, well, let's look at this really quick. Hebrews 12, starting at verse 22, referring to the church in connection with Zion. Notice how big this is. Here's Hebrews 12:22. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. We underestimate our situation. We think the Old Testament and then the New Testament and then now, and now our job is to just try to be good and lay low. All the big stuff happened before our lifetime. But everything that happened in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, all of it happened so that this could happen. That you could be here today with brothers and sisters safe on every level. This is a big deal. I couldn't think of anything better, but it's kind of like in a football game. There's the huddle, there's that part, the plan, and then there's the actual hiking of the ball, and then the pass. It's like receiving the pass and then just standing there. It's time to do something. There's some momentum here. If anything, you can see that in the names being listed here. There's momentum, and it doesn't stop with Jesus. It continues in a greater way. The ball is still in play here. Remember I said before, at least I'm this way, and other people tell me about their genealogies. I'm pretty interested, but for the most part, unless it involves you, it's not that interesting to you. So here's something else you need to know. Maybe it'll make this list a little bit more interesting to you. It is your genealogy. This is the lineage that led to you. And that means something very important. It's your turn. It's not your turn to just live life. It's your turn to follow through, to be a part of the promise, to follow the king out of captivity. It's all led to you. What happens now? There are people that I bet you can name in your past who had a huge influence on you spiritually and could probably hold up as the reason why you are a Christian. In a sense, they're your ancestor, I guess you could say. There are people all around us who need you to do the same for them. That makes you part of this list of names. Since you and I follow Jesus, the promise is now in our hands. It doesn't make sense to simply hold on to it. You're the next name. So tomorrow, it's going to be important to help others see that God created them for a reason, for a purpose. And until they live for that purpose, they're not really living at all. This morning, if you're not with Jesus, if you haven't been baptized, if you're disconnected because of sin, it's important to make things right. We want to encourage anybody to do that. You can do that today. You can do that right now. Until then, nothing's really happening with life. Living with a purpose that's been given to you, that's vital. Otherwise, you're not really living life at all. This list of names, it's so easy to just kind of glance at it and not really see what's going on here, this seemingly tedious passage. But it's telling us something incredibly important. And it's simply this: it's your turn. The promises have been made, the promises have been kept, and now the eyes of the Lord are on you. It's your turn. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? I would encourage all of us to keep this in mind every day, and especially now as we stand together and sing.